Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the troubled teen industry, which, by the way, is a multi-billion-dollar business. But we're not just looking at the programs themselves. We're going to focus on the hidden figures, the people who actually designed the systems of control at its very core. We're going to trace the entire blueprint back to a single, pretty shocking source.
So, it all starts with a question that, thousands of desperate families face every single year. Your teenager is in a serious crisis, and you have no idea what to do. Well, the industry has a very specific answer for you, a pathway that looks professional, clinical, and totally secure.
But this is where what they sell you and what actually happens, well, they're worlds apart. The industry talks about sensitive transport and clinical care. But for so many kids, the reality is being taken from their homes by involuntary escorts and getting sent into a system of deeply conflicted referrals. This isn't just about branding, it's a system. And to really get how that system works, we've got to go back to where it all began.
The playbook for the troubled teen industry didn't come from some breakthrough in adolescent psychology or a new educational theory. Nope, its origins are way, way darker. In fact, they trace right back to one of the most notorious American cults of the 20th century.
And that cult was Synanon. Now, it started out as this really radical drug rehab program, but it eventually morphed into a violent, all-controlling group. It got infamous for its brutal methods, it had its own paramilitary force, and it even got into criminal activity, including, and this is true, attempted murder by putting a rattlesnake in a lawyer's mailbox.
So how did they get that kind of control? Well, as the author Maya Shalovitz explains it, their whole model was based on one thing: breaking people. It was a formula, and it was brutal. Isolation, humiliation, hard labor, and sleep deprivation. All of it just cynically disguised as some kind of therapy. The goal was never to heal. It was to completely dismantle a person's identity until they were totally dependent on the group.
And here it is. This is the direct connection. A former Synanon member named Mel Wasserman founded the very first major troubled teen program, CEDU, back in 1967. He didn't invent a new system. He just adapted the one he already knew, repackaging Synanon's methods for a new and very lucrative market: troubled teens.
And look at this table. It shows you just how direct the copy and paste job was. It was basically just a rebranding. Synanon's game, which was this brutal group attack therapy where people were just verbally assaulted, that became CEDU's Wraps. The crazy 72-hour marathon session called The Trip, it was just renamed The Prophet. The words changed, but the actual architecture of psychological control was identical.
All right, so let's get to the people, the architects who helped build this world. First up is a guy named Bill Lane. He was a pivotal figure from day one, but his true role? It was deliberately hidden for years. So if you were looking at CEDU's official corporate documents in the mid-90s, you'd see Bill Lane listed as just an outside vendor. He was the guy who ran the transport service, the one who brought kids to the school. A contractor, separate from the main leadership team.
But newly surfaced documents tell a completely different story. This is a faculty handbook from just 5 years earlier, May 1990, and it lists him right there at the top, president of CEDU School, a position even above the headmaster. He wasn't some vendor, he was the guy in charge.
And you know what? The cover-up worked.
This quote from a survivor shows just how effective it was. For the students, and even for some of the staff on the ground, the official story was their reality. The man who was actually the school's president was known only as the transport guy. This timeline really lays out his whole career. It all starts in Synanon back in the 50s. By 1967, he's a co-founder of CEDU. In 1990, he's the president, and then look at this pivot. By 95, his role is completely concealed, and he's suddenly just the vendor. And then when CEDU finally collapses in 2005, what does he do? He immediately launches his own transport company. His entire career was built on the system from the very beginning to the very end.
Okay, on to our second architect, Dr. Jim Powell. So while Bill Lane controlled the physical pipeline into the program, Powell controlled the psychiatric pipeline for the kids who were already inside. So at the very heart of Powell's role was this massive, and I mean massive, conflict of interest. Like Lane, he was a former Synanon member, and he serves as the clinical director for CEDU. But at the exact same time, he was also on staff at a nearby psychiatric hospital, Charter Hospital. He was on both sides of every single referral.
Let's just walk through how this system actually worked. Step 1. A staffer at CEDU decides a student needs to be hospitalized. Step 2, their own psychologist, Jim Powell, helps facilitate the admission to the very hospital where he also works. And then the final step, CEDU staff, not the parents, but the staff, are authorized to sign the admission papers. It was a perfect, completely closed loop.
And the kids, they knew. They absolutely knew what was going on. This survivor testimony says it all. They knew that Charter Hospital had a ward that was, for all intents and purposes, just an extension of CEDU. It wasn't just any hospital. It was part of the whole system.
Now, you might think the story ends when the parent organization, CEDU, finally collapsed. But it wasn't an ending at all. It was more like a dispersal event that seeded this model across the entire industry.
So in 2005, after decades of operation and facing numerous allegations of abuse, CEDU officially went bankrupt and shut down all its campuses.
But closing the doors didn't kill the model. Instead, it was like opening the floodgates. It released all of its key players and its core methods out into the wider industry, kind of like seeds in the wind, which allowed them to replicate and evolve.
And I mean, this happened immediately. Bill Lane incorporated his own transport company the very next day after CEDU announced it was closing. Jim Powell, he just went over to work for Benchmark Transitions, a huge program that was founded by another CEDU alum. The people and the systems just put on new logos and kept going.
Both men continued their work for another 14 years, staying as these really influential figures in the industry they helped create from the ground up. They both passed away in 2019, having built these careers that span more than 4 decades, all the way from the early days of a cult to a modern, multi-billion-dollar industry.
So, okay, they're gone. Why does the story of these two men still matter right now? Because the systems they designed, well, they didn't die with them. They actually became the industry standard.
The architecture of control that they pioneered, that involuntary transport system that Bill Lane formalized, and the captive clinical pipeline that Jim Powell perfected, these things became foundational. They aren't just isolated practices at a few bad apple programs. They are the pillars of how the entire industry operates to this day.
And that leaves us with a pretty fundamental question. The original architects may be gone, but the structures they built are still standing, and they're impacting thousands of teenagers every single year. So, when the architects are gone, who's accountable for the architecture?